started. Good morning again for those of you who just joined us. This is the second day of a two-day conference on community, and we are particularly fortunate to have with us here in the room psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas, who has been called the most influential psychoanalyst writing in English today. Christopher Bollas studied history as an undergraduate at Berkeley, then went on to earn a PhD in English literature from SUNY Buffalo, then a master in social work from Smith College. He undertook psychoanalytic training at London's Tavistock Clinic and with the British Psychoanalytical Society. He was a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the mid-1980s, and during that time also served as Director of Education at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And along with his academic career, he has worked as a psychotherapist since 1967. His work has deeply impacted psychoanalytic theory and practice, and it also provides fresh ways of engaging with culture, history, and as we will see today, politics. He has published more than 100 papers as well as numerous books, including The Shadow of the Object, Psychoanalysis of the Unthought Known, Being a Character, Psychoanalysis and Self-Experience, and When the Sun Bursts, The Enigma of Schizophrenia. The Christopher Bollas Reader was published by Routledge in 2011. Now, today's presentation, The Democratic Frame of Mind, is part of a forthcoming book, Meaning and Melancholia, Life in the Age of Bewilderment. And when Christopher and I discussed the possibility of his presenting parts of this recent work, we did spend some time weighing whether and how his particular focus on democracy as a theory of mind would fit in a conference devoted to exploring forms and experiences of community building. And I think that yesterday's panel, as well as this morning's presentations and the evening plenary, bore out the relevance and indeed the importance when talking about community of considering the relationship between the internal world and the politics of democracy. And I'm thinking in particular, for those of you who took part in the conference yesterday, of the discussions that took place about group dynamics and the politics of memorialization. And also Pablo Helguera and Suzanne Lacey's discussion of the relationship between public culture and power relations. So I can say that I'm even more delighted after yesterday to be able to welcome Christopher Bollas here. And I look forward to his now presenting his most timely talk. So please join me in welcoming him now. Thank you.
And they very thoughtfully and generously said, sure, we can fit you in. So I'm very grateful for this. I'm going to approach this topic really by telling you the thesis to begin with before I forget it. And the thesis really is this. And it derives in large part from my work as a psychoanalyst, which I'll get to in a minute. The thesis is that the Greek theory of democratic government, I believe, is predicated upon an understanding of the nature of mental life itself. In other words, we are Democrats, mental Democrats. The mind is democracy. Therefore, the implementation of this understanding into government is natural. It's quite natural. And it's also why it's wrong to identify democracy as originating in the 7th, 6th, or 5th century Athens, when in fact we can find democracies all over the world. The Iroquois nation had a democratic form of meetings for 800 years. There are democracies of all sorts of cultures all over the world. And in fact, some writers who are experts in very ancient culture argue, it depends upon who the readers are, in my view, convincingly that hunter-gatherers were democratic groups, that they discussed issues in common between the men and the women, that they put the ideas out there and then they arrive at decisions. It sort of makes phylogenetic sense, doesn't it? When I visit sometimes corporations, I do some consultancy work, and they want to know how to improve their life, how to improve their organizations, etc. I ask to see the board, or I ask them who's on the board. And it's not long before it's usually the case that on the board, let's say 24 folks, 22 will be men and a couple women. And I'll say, well, you're already brain dead. You're only using part of your brain. So if you really want to know how to improve yourself, you're going to have to include more women, because women think differently than men do in a very interesting, creative way. The two together are incredibly important. Now that's an oversimplification, because it's not just that gender creates, the difference of gender creates a certain sort of greater democracy if you include women, and of course the Greeks did not. Women and slaves were not included in Greek democracy. But the more people that you include, not just from a gender point of view, but from an ethnic point of view and so on, the greater that you have the capacity here to think about options, and you're going to have a better chance to survive. So if you think of this as a phylogenetic necessity, then the death drive from Freud's point of view, which is the inclination to pull back into an enclave, sort of an autistic movement for Freud. The death drive, which is to pull back into a sense of community of the same, actually is a good way to disappear. It's a good way to eliminate your prospects for survival. If you, on the other hand, include as many possible people as you can, to provide as many ideas as is possible as you face any form of reality right in front of you, even though the process is going to be slower, because it's going to have to be more inclusive, isn't it? You're more likely to survive as a group. So a more inclusive community, one that can include highly divergent and quite opposed points of view, is going to stand a much greater chance of a robust future than the one that sort of pulls back into itself. So in contemporary America, we can see communities pulling back into group positions where everyone, so to speak, feels better if they're actually back into their known area, having very little to do with people on the other side of other issues. That is a very good way to decline as a country or as a group. Okay. Nonetheless, the Greeks had an idea. Even though it irritated Plato, it irritated Socrates, it irritated Aristotle, the whole idea of democracy, of having to sit there in a room listening to people, many of whom they thought were just stupid. Why should you have stupid people in a room and have to do what they thought you should do? Nonetheless, it's what the people wanted. It seemed more popular for periods of time than the tyrannies or the oligarchies and so on and so forth. It allows people to do something that is really quite important. Democracy allows the right of free assembly. Not for everyone, as we know, but in principle, it raised the right to assemble. And it also said that in the case of, as you assemble, you have the right of free speech. Let's take those two, the right to assemble and the right to speak your mind without fear of punishment, etc., as a sort of axis of democracy. Now, I'm not going to be here just speaking about democratic governments. I'm going to be speaking about the democratic process. But, and so therefore we can say that these axes of right to assemble, right to speak your mind freely, are the basis not just of group life, of democratic life, of the government, but a way of thinking, in fact, of developing your thinking. So the more experienced you are as a civilization with this process, the more access you have to the human mind, or human minds. The more access you have to human minds, the greater the freedom of speech and representation. However disturbing those thoughts and ideas are, the more likely you are to survive and thrive as a community. It's a big deal. In fact, I would argue that the democratic process is intrinsically therapeutic. It is the first Tolkien cure. And psychoanalysis, in my view, derives 2,000 years later, because they will trace themselves back to Plato, Aristotle, derives from that Tolkien cure. The right to speak freely in the presence of the other. Well, that is indeed what the psychoanalyst promises to the psychoanalyst. Whatever you say in this room, I shall remain neutral. I shall just listen. And by the way, just listening is a big deal. And you will speak your mind. So free speech. Okay. We'll come back to the right of assembly, which is more complicated in a way. So therefore, psychoanalysis and analytical psychology, Gestalt, and all the psychologies that sort of emerged in the 20th century can be seen as, let's call it, unconscious collaborative evolutionary processes in the development of the democratic process. Now we need to talk about the two communities. There's the community that we see around us, the community of the actual people. I mean, it bears signs that are familiar to us, no matter what your community is. If you're an evangelical Christian, your community will be centered usually around a particular church. There will be particular people in that group. There will be particular texts that you refer to and read, and so on and so forth. So we all know about the many communities that we live in and walk through in our life. And that is very important. But I will tell you, let's say, a turning point in my life as an adolescent. I went to high school in Laguna Beach. And I had a wonderful history teacher. Well, we all loved him. And one week, he said, guess what we're doing next week? We're going to go for a field trip. We always liked field trips in high school. It was even though Laguna Beach was wonderful, you always want to get out of town, no matter where it is. So we went to Disneyland. And we went to Disneyland to attend what was called the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade. And the speaker was Ronald Reagan. Yeah. So a couple of my friends and I, well, we were not too happy with this. We were quite shocked. Why did the good Mr. Simpson take us there? And then, well, we decided with a bit of a protest. The whole group, we were in the stadium. We're all meant to stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag, except for myself, E.G., Kirsten, and two others. We all stayed sitting. Well, it wasn't too long before we became exceedingly unpopular. And I had the misfortune of being somewhat a public figure in those days, because I was ASB president. So that meant that John Birch decided to get on my case, which meant that in the course of the next year, perfectly ordinary people who would come up to me on the street or tap me on the shoulder at the cinema would say the most unbelievably disturbing things to me. They would be crazy, absolutely nuts. Not to speak of the fact that we were wondering to ourselves, how come Mr. Simpson turns out to be this extreme right-wing zealot? He doesn't behave like one. I mean, we never saw anything like this in the classroom. Yet, my word, outside at his community there, he morphed into someone else. Okay. Let's go ahead a few years. I then was involved in the civil rights movement in the South, in Charlottesville. I was at UVA for a couple of years. Then I moved from there to Berkeley, and one way or the other, got to know folks in the African American community, worked with the Black Panther Party. In fact, was their Peace and Freedom rep in Orange County in the '68 election. That was an interesting experience, and I think they picked me for that because they needed someone to be able to disseminate literature on the beaches of Southern California. Yes. And you have to be able to run fast. Because if you drop literature on someone's beach towel and you heard, what the hell? You know, you may have to move pretty quickly and know how to get off the beach and onto the roadways and hide for a while. So they picked me because I was a white guy, I knew where I was, and I could run fast. Then, after that, spent a time in Buffalo, working with a community organization called the Erie County Manpower Development Project. And there the idea of this extraordinary project was to go into the ghetto, find out who the leaders were, bring them together into a building, and teach them psychoanalysis, teach them interviewing. Why? Because there were so many problems inside the community that these folks needed to find a way as a group to talk to each other about manifest content issues and then latent issues. And so the leaders, there was to be, the idea here was that no matter who these folks were who were selected in each block, we would go to each block, ask the people on the block, who's the most important person you think on this block? And that was it. Whoever was, it was purely democratic, whoever was elected, that was it. Well, we had the most interesting group of about 40 people. About 6 or 7 of them were prostitutes, there were drug dealers. They were bad folks, apparently, but they were intelligent, they were the leaders of the community, and they were really, really interested in psychoanalysis, which was kind of mind-blowing. So we talked about how you talk to people, how you interview people, and I learned, of course, they taught me. I taught them what I knew about the unconscious life and so on. They loved sexuality and oppression, big time. So it was much easier to talk to them than it was to talk to white kids at the University of Buffalo, who had a harder time getting to those issues than the African American community did. But I had been puzzling over, let's call it the two worlds, because when I was at Berkeley doing a graduate thesis, I picked the Puritan community of 16th century, 17th century New England, in particular Michael Wigglesworth, those who wrote diaries. I was very interested in what was going on in their minds, because of course their behavior belied their ideology. From an ideological point of view, they were Puritans, you know, pure, ideal. From a behavioral point of view, they really were screw-ups. They were totally dysfunctional from the moment they got there. Reading Wigglesworth then was a certain kind of way to begin to read a lot of literature, a lot of fiction. I'd been in history, and I thought, well, no, I think I'm going to learn more about people by reading literature. So this is kind of like a long introduction to a simple point. When we think of community, it might be helpful to think of two fundamental types of community. There's the actual one that we, I mentioned the Pentecostal church, the communities that we think of ourselves being part of. And then there's the community that's the human mind itself. Mental life is a community. We spend far more time hanging out with what Melanie Klein called internal objects than we do with actual people. Far more time. And in the internal world, in the other community, we have thoughts, we say things that we would never, ever say in the actual communities. In fact, actual communities really implicitly demand cohesion. They demand camaraderie. In the internal world, we can turn to a friend and say the most awful things, think the most awful things, wish the worst possible things. That's the internal world. And when you begin to put those two worlds side by side, it's a disturbing rift that you see, because we're naturally more interested in talking about the actual communities of this world, and we're scared to death to talk about the communities of the internal worlds of the individual mind and of the group mind. Why? Because inside the internal world, the internal community, there's madness in all of us. There are no saints. There are no sinners. There is no really sustained kumbaya moment. And for every rainbow coalition of the mind, there is a genocide to destroy it. And that's because we're Homo sapiens. And we might want to get out of it. And there are certain sorts of ways we can try to get out of it. If you stop eating and drinking and have a very anorectic type of life, you can pretty much diminish mental capabilities. You can take certain sorts of drugs to sort of try to blow your mind. You can opt for forms of narcissism that are sort of delusional, in which you idealize yourself to the point of beatification. We're beatifying ourselves all the time. You can try to get together a community to adore you. Adoration can kind of work in that way. You can then try to escape your mind. But at the end of the day, we're left with a very complicated world. Now, the genius of the democratic process is that in the most subtle sort of way, when the Greeks got themselves together to do this in a formal sort of way, they knew that they were going to have people in that room who had very different views of things. In fact, they would have people in that room who hated each other, who wanted to kill each other, who would wish ill upon their fellow men. But so why do it? Why embark on that? Because, in a sense, that freedom allows every single participant in that room to know that that group stands for all of us. Everyone is represented in that meeting. Now, I came to learn that in a very different way. And this is the basis in some ways of my talk today. When I did my training at the Tavistock Clinic in adult psychoanalysis and group psychoanalysis and group relations, my training in psychoanalysis proper was at the Institute of Psychoanalysis. But I was trained in conducting a Tavistock group. Now, a Tavi group is really quite interesting. 10 people who are complete strangers show up for group therapy. But Tavi group therapy is very different from American group therapy. In Tavi group therapy, the consultant, first the group shows up on time. The leader walks in, sits down, or consultant as he or she might be called, and doesn't say a thing. Stares straight like this. So inevitably someone says something, are you going to say something? Do we start now? Or one or two people might say, gee, he's not saying anything. I mean, I guess we're supposed to. Well, would you want to start? I know someone's going to start through somewhere, but time's passing, etc. Okay. So there's a certain kind of anxiety, and there's a certain sort of evolution of the group, etc. Let's move it forward a little bit. Well, the group leader might say something like, after a while, the group is anxious about what to do here. Now let's imagine that someone called Ted turns to Bob and says, after meeting 3 or 4 times, you know, Bob, I don't really, here you're starting talking about yourself, about your corporation, and so, there are 9 other people in this room. Bob, do you really have to keep going on like this? It's pretty irritating. Bob might say something like, well, wait a minute here. Nobody else was saying anything. I kind of stepped in, to try to help out here. And Louise might say something like, I think things are pretty good. I mean, they're not great, but they're pretty good. Okay, the group leader might say something like, the group is unsure how to divide its time here. Now, I can't keep producing these sorts of examples, but they are endless. The technique was this. No matter what one person said in the room, the interpretation always had to be the group thinks that. The group thinks that. So in America, if Ted had said what he had to Bob, an American therapist at that time might have said, well, gee, Bob, how's it feel? I mean, what's it feel like for you to be like this? Do you want to say what you feel back to Bob? No. Never. Now, what's the function of the group thinks that? It is predicated on the idea that whatever anyone in the group is saying or thinking or feeling, etc., is spoken for everyone in that room. Everyone. And that is democracy. That is, anyone speaking at any moment in time is speaking for everyone. There is inside this a remarkable inclusiveness. So folks who are constantly getting themselves in trouble, like hysterics, narcissists who are seen as, you're taking too much time, you're always talking about yourself or whatever. after a while, because each person speaking or presenting themselves was speaking for all, interestingly enough, the burden of the negative identities of having a psychopathology or a character disorder, they just started to disappear. They started to disappear. Now, I thought that was pretty remarkable because the analyst was not making a big effort at all to work with the more difficult people in the room. It's just that the process seemed, if one spoke for all, to be remarkably liberating and freeing. Then as the time went on over about a year, the group started to form what I came to understand as its own mind. Because a group is a community. It starts to form its own way of thinking, right? Predicated upon those who've been there contributing. They trust each other. So people would finish sentences for each other. Somebody would say something like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do this afternoon. Somebody else might say, well, I suppose I could go to the bookstore. The differences between one person and another sort of faded away. And then there were always people say, well, I don't know what it's all about, but it's something we really should do. Yeah, I know. It's always bothering me about that. Yeah, well, I wouldn't know what it was. What is the it? What is it referring to? Well, it wasn't particularly referring to anything, I guess, except maybe it was referring to everything. So a dreaming quality occupied those rooms at the Tavistock. An hour and a half, once a week. This went on for 3.5 years. And the strangest thing happened, all these people, they were very different from one another. It started to become a form of love. I mean, I then remember writing in my notebooks, is love understanding? Is that what it is? If you love someone, is it really basically to understand them? Especially if they're very different from you? Is that what this is? So, I was very moved by that experience. At the same time, in Great Britain, we had ways of working with the individual person based upon a group life. In other words, we learned an awful lot in groups that we could take into our work in sessions. And so if you look at the what a person is saying in an analysis or in psychotherapy, he or she is going to be commenting upon many different people in their lives, many different events in their lives, and so on. And if you look at the speaker as really just a kind of nominal position, consciousness is an interlocutor. In fact, what's being transmitted are multitudes, contradictory ideas. A whole community of others is in there. And so you can't assume that hegemony here is simply because it's this person speaking. No. And one of my supervisors, Paul Hyman, taught me, her mantra was, Christopher, whenever someone's saying something to you, have in the back of your mind the following question: who is speaking, to whom, about what, and why now? Because her assumption was that at any moment in time, you couldn't assume that the speaker was speaking for some known entity. They were representing something. Okay. And I remember saying to one person who had been very critical of me, he said, well, he said, you should meet my father. You don't know my father, but you should meet him. I think I just have. And it was a very simple thing to say. I think I just have. But it was based upon the fact that as this chap started to talk about his dad, he became his father, or the father in his mind. So Melanie Klein had a theory of infancy and childhood, which I think is largely correct. I can't agree with everything she says, but let's go to the internal world. The so-called objects of our mind are going to suffer the vicissitudes of our emotions, of our needs, our fears, and so many of our internal objects are not going to be doing so well. We may commit reparation, try to be better to our internal objects, say, I'm tired of thinking negatively about this person, I'm going to think positive about it. So we do have very good parts of ourselves. We are being constructive. But Klein learned something about kids. Moms and dads would come in, they'd have a 3-year-old and say, I don't know what's the matter. She's terrified of us. We're really nice to her. We play with her a lot, we tell her stories. But, I mean, she goes like this. And, she doesn't say much to us. But when she's with her friends, she seems to be happy and playful and so on. So what's the story? So the analyst might say, well, what's been happening? Oh, I know, she's been a little different since her brother was born. Or some such. So what Klein realized is that by looking at the drawings of children, where they have these, if they're going to show drawings of themselves, then their parents. Parents are like giants, often like balloons with ears. They're huge, they're inflated. The children like tiny little creatures. And, all right, there is a huge difference between the actual size of a child and the monsters that are their parents. That's true. But then what Klein realized is this, that if you, as a child, if you're quote-unquote attacking your mother or your father, or in your mind, or your brother, that person knows they are being attacked by you. And why not they get furious? They swell up. You can't talk to me like that. I'm going to get you. And I'm going to do it when you're asleep. And then I can kill you. So the kids just, terrified. If any of you work with folks who grew up in villages of West Africa, in Kenya and elsewhere, where village life, you'll know that if you've had a dream where in your dream you have committed harm against somebody else in the village, you've got to go to that hut as early as you can in the morning and provide offerings to ask for forgiveness for what you've done. In turn, if somebody is waiting to beat the hell out of you when you come out of your hut, you know that you've done something in their dream that you're being held to account for. So this idea that we're damaging internal objects who are out to get us, it's a big deal. So Klein took these observations on the children and said, well, no, we may be okay to each other in the actual world, in the community of actual cells, we may be being quite nice to one another. But in the internal world, we may be the victim of very bad thoughts and feelings. We may actually be committing them against others. So we're not doing so well in the internal world. Now, we can see that today, in contemporary culture, when someone does something heinous, murders many people, one of the more typical questions is, what's the motive? I mean, do we know why this person did what he did? Maybe he's a terrorist. Well, if he's not a terrorist, then why did he do this? Most of them are men. Why did he do this? There's got to be a reason for this. Well, because of 60 years or so of psychophobia, in North America especially, but it's not just in North America. By psychophobia, I mean a fear of understanding, a dread of insight, and a hatred of the psychologies, including psychoanalysis, analytical psychology. Because of the hatred of the mind, we have almost no understanding of human mental life. Congratulations, America. I mean, it's taken 50 or 60 years to dumb ourselves down to the point where we're kind of psychological ignorances. And talking heads on one program or another, I don't know, well, maybe did his neighbor say anything bad to him? No. So why would somebody just go off the rails? It's called fantasy life. It's called fantasy life. And no, you don't have to watch video games to have one. People were imagining killing each other long before electronic devices came along to assist you. They're prosthetic devices, sure. Sure they are. But nonetheless, we have been murdering each other in our minds since we were around. I worked with someone in Rwanda who was part of the massacre. She was a victim. Her family was, not her. Within weeks after the resolution of the genocide in Rwanda, when the Tutsis and the Hutus were talking to each other again, people who had murdered members of her family were back asking for forgiveness. They were holding hands with each other. They were embracing each other. And answering the question, why, they said, I don't know. Something overcame us. I don't know. Well, if you have the strange fate of being a psychoanalyst, I'm afraid you do know. You know only too well, because you spend a lot of time in the archaeology of the human mind. And in that world, we can be extremely destructive. So, if we see how a democratic process enables us, in theory, to bring more disturbed parts of ourselves into the public realm, however disturbing it is, better that it's out there than it's hidden. Better that we understand that we're all racists, we're all sexists, we're all murderers. We're all so wonderful. We're caring, we're kind, we're good, but we're also terrible. And so we can come perhaps later to defenses against that. There are different forms of paranoia. One is the paranoia in which you, in effect, say, these other people are out there to get us. This is the conspiracy theory formations, which is very common and very common these days. The other is what I call sanctimonious rectitude, which is another form of paranoia. The French have called it white paranoia, by which they mean the blank paranoia. The paranoia of the empty self. I am completely pure. I signify righteousness. I am not them. That's my position. I am not them. And so, in the polarization within the contemporary community, contemporary democracy, between the self-righteous and those who believe that the world's out to get them, and they've got to do things about it, you don't have much of a middle ground that's viable. It's kind of hard to find it. Let's go back to the other aspect of democracy, which is harder to describe, but no less important. The right of assembly. Now, when you assemble people, for the Greeks, it was the assembly of citizens. The problem with the concept of a citizen is it's sort of like an everyman, isn't it? The term means we're all alike. We're all citizens. It actually took Hume, in his essay on liberty, to kind of take that word, he didn't do it deliberately, but to in a way talk about how people in a democratic process were very different from one another. So when you assemble together, you're not just neutral people, citizens, expressing ideas. You're radically different people colliding with each other. And so the democratic process is also a remarkable social process in which people who are so different from one another, and I don't just mean ethnically different or religiously different or gender differences, or those too, sure, but also each person, each personality is a specific aesthetic being. Each of us is a theory. Each of us has axioms that generate the way we behave in our relations to other people around us. And inevitably, we're going to engage in what I call interformality. Interformality is a type of intersubjectivity, but it's really simply a way of saying, well, I create an impression on you, you create an impression on me, and we impress each other in this way without it ever being made explicit. And we leave in the unconscious mind of all of us a sort of, I would call it psychic tapestry. Freud said it's a cluster of ideas. And let me demonstrate this for you. I'm going to give you a name. And something will happen inside you. Okay? Um, 'cause, 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 ' Hillary Clinton. Now, as you quote unquote think about what's just occurred inside you, what has occurred inside you is that which is constellated in your internal world, in your unconscious mind, would have been registered by you. Now, some of you might have pictured her, but you will have felt her. Now, she's had an impression on you, and you may never have met her. Right? But then take all the people that you know you've met, and they have impressed you. This is the term Freud uses again and again and again. Impression. So when we're personalities forms, we impress others with ourselves. We leave in the recipients the trace of our movement through them. We affect them in different ways. Now, this is part of our internal world where we are the recipient of the idiom of the other. If I were to stop and say, the Pope, you would have a different set immediately occurs to you. It's just not something you sit there and think about. It's boom, it's right there. Okay. But again, I'm using distant people, so you would have to substitute them for people that you know. So take the democracy of people assembling in a room. Yes, there's the free movement of ideas, yes. But also there's a free movement of characters impressing, leaving these tapestries inside each and every one of them. This is very crucial. But something, to go back to the Beyond group that I mentioned earlier, sorry, the Tavistock group, it was based upon the work of Wilfred Beyond. You will see there that, I argue, characters start to lose their definitive effect on the group. So that one person can speak for another, character elements are passed around the room. One person can be in a state of psychotic anxiety 1 week. The next week, somebody else will be. One person could be the individual grieving in the room, whilst the next week somebody else will be representing the loss and grieving. There was different elements of human personality are shifted around in the room between different people. So what happens when democracy is working is that the powerful effect, the interformal impact of oneself upon the other starts to fade out. It's not like it disappears, it will be there. But it ceases to be such a dominating dimension inside a group. Now this is deeply therapeutic if we want to come together in this world, whether in small communities, in the nation, or international. We're going to have to spend a hell of a lot more time in small groups, medium-sized groups, and large groups, hanging out together. We do need to use the wisdom of democracy as a process to help us do this, because it needs to be objectified. We have to begin to see how and what ways democracy is therapeutic in order for us to go forward. There's no reason why, if a country's sending lots of folks to do military training, you couldn't have a new type of Peace Corps in which individuals went in to do group relations training and learned how to bring people who were afraid of each other, disturbed by each other, and so on, to bring them into a room together. Because if you read the literature on mediation and negotiation, whether it's the Camp David Accords, whether it's Oslo, whether it's Dayton, whether it's Stormont, for the most part, the history of negotiation is of people who hate each other, and would not want to be in the same room with each other unless they were armed, but they could kill each other. Over time, those barriers break down, and guess what? They find that they're human beings. They find things in common with each other. And yet, no one is a saint. There are no saints. And nobody ultimately is only a sinner. They will have sinned. So Those of you who followed the Northern Ireland Accords know that Martin McInnes and Ian Paisley were profound enemies. They hated each other, more so than any two. McInnes and Paisley really hated each other. By the end of Stormont, after 10 years, 15 years of negotiating and a lot of argy-bargy, they became best friends. They were called the Chuckle Buddies. So nobody would ever have said that was going to happen. Anybody experienced in doing group psychoanalysis, anyone experienced in Tavistock groups knows that is exactly what happens. So here's the question. If a significant few around the world of psychoanalysts, analytical psychologists, group relations training workers, if we know this, if we know we can solve problems like this, why aren't we making use of that? Now, I can come here and give a talk like this, but this will be nothing, I'm sorry, with all due respect to all of you present, it's nothing because, in a sense, what we're facing here, I'm afraid, is unconscious wishes to engage in profound struggle with each other and to kill each other. So I'm up here in a way speaking about this topic rather than other things I would probably prefer to discuss, because I do think that the way things are going, the way that nations are behaving with each other in the most primitive possible ways, developing extremely paranoid positions vis-a-vis each other, we face a very dire consequence. So let's just talk a little bit about projective identification, and I'm going to leave us time to discuss this. That's the best thing. Projective identification, as I expect some of you know, is when we take something in me, I project into someone else. Now, you can't project an aspect of yourself into someone else unless there's some credibility to the projection, all right? So let's go back to Tony Blair and George Bush. Now, they're looking there at this guy, Saddam Hussein, right? And they're thinking, he's a bad guy. He's got weapons. Yeah, he's a bad guy, and he's got weapons. And the point they were making was he's got weapons of mass destruction. Okay, let's push that to the side slightly. I mean, those of us in Europe at the time, or some of us, were looking at, yeah, if he's got weapons of mass destruction, what's this guy doing with the biggest, stupidest gun in the world aimed at Israel? I mean, those of you who know about Saddam's gun, it was 1 mile long. He got a British company to construct it for him, big cylinders, and it was going to shoot a bullet towards Israel. I mean, a very large bullet, but still a bullet, basically. It was going to be the world's largest gun. And he's got weapons. This is his weapon of mass destruction. I mean, it's comic if it weren't not funny. Okay. So, the United States and Great Britain go to war against Saddam Hussein. And CNN, and Judith Butler does a wonderful riff on this in one of her books, the blanket coverage of shock and awe. Shock and awe. And you see the most extraordinary visuals of annihilation of a people. Now, do you think at any point in time someone in the Bush cabinet or in the Blair cabinet said, about those weapons of mass destruction, I mean, could that be us? Could we be the ones with the weapons of mass destruction? Is there any reason to fear us? I mean, anyone around here? Anyone? Anyone? Mm-mm. No. It was Saddam who had the weapons of mass. We don't have them. He's got them. And, okay, we got rid of them. But now, where do we put our weapons of mass destruction? What do we do with this part of us? It just simply wants to go around killing people. We want to kill them. We want to dominate the world. We want to do this. Iran, thank God, raise your hand. Iranians, yes. You evil people. We're on to you, and we know that you've done this and this and this and this. So if you are a country like this one, unfortunately, great country in many ways, but as Richard Hofstadter said in Paranoia in American Politics, as paranoid as they come. Right now, without any psychological insight, we're more dangerous than any country on earth, and that includes North Korea. Because we don't know what we're doing, and we're projecting our own aggression into other countries. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that there are other countries out there that are all just fabulous. That's not true. That is not true. But if you believe that might makes right, if you believe in regime change, if you believe in the use of military force to solve problems, then you're communicating, you're offloading your violence into other people. And to go back to Melanie Klein, what does this mean? Well, if you take her paradigm that if you attack people in your mind and vilify them, they're then going to be very angry at being treated like this. So you can see how as we begin to attack the North Korean leadership, or attack the Iranian leadership, or whomever, when you begin to do that, then you are going to inevitably create a far more vicious opponent in your own mind than exists in reality. And you're certainly not inclined to talk to them. Why would you do something like that? So we have, if we could bring these leaders together into a relatively small group, if we could do a Camp David with Bush and, sorry, not Bush, but Donald Trump and the North Korean leader, yes, as disappointing as it might be, in time, they would get along. Yep, they would. That may kind of spoil the party, spoil the fun, or spoil the urge towards what I call orgasm. And what is orgasm? Orgasm is a drive of a sexual kind towards the annihilation of everything and everybody. If you want to do some research on this, go and read the literature on serial killers. They're the most sort of standalone exemplars of a orgasm. Serial killers orgasm, not all of them, orgasm in the act of murder itself. So they are sexually excited by it and they have an orgasm. And when they take down the other person, they're doing it because they want to destroy everything. They want to destroy life itself. If you ask, what do you have against this one person? No, no, no. I wanted to watch life go away. I wanted to see what excited me was I could extinguish life. That was it. So what we face now is this. If we keep retaining psychological stupidity, which licenses us to murder people around the world and possibly move towards nuclear war, to what extent are we conceding to the death instinct, this urge to kill because it's pleasurable? Now, that goes against the brain. If I were to say this in a larger format, I'd probably have to run for cover after a while, because that's not a very polite thing to be saying in a larger group. Very unpopular. But we have to be able to objectify those parts of ourselves which are awful. I'm going to end this bit by just reading you. I thought it's both amusing and also sad. It's Hillary Clinton, who, by the way, I think, look, did I idealize her? No, of course not. But a problem for her with her emails is this. The question, well, what are there in her emails? At the time, I was working as a consultant to some extent for them. And I said, well, look, this is a problem that can be solved, but because if you say, well, what is a woman thinking? What is she keeping hidden? That is a classic question. That's a question that raises anxieties. And into that anxiety, you can project anything and everything. Oh, it's got to be this, it's got to be that, it's got to be this, it's got to be that. So here we get a woman being pilloried for the fact that she doesn't disclose, not about her emails, it's about her private internal world. And she's a woman, and we're not going to trust that. Are you crazy? She's not a man. She's not a man. So she was therefore then treated horrifically in the media and by people. You may know that after the election, she came up to Ryan Zinke. He was a congressman and part of the Trump campaign. He's now part of the administration of Trump, or was part. He may have kicked out. I haven't been able to keep up with that. But at lunch on the 20th of January, Zinke brought his wife up and his wife Lolita to say hello. And Hillary was really quite stunned by this. And she said maybe he'd forgotten because he didn't come equipped with any garlic or wood stakes or whatever when he used to ward off the Antichrist. But, she said, but I hadn't forgotten. She says, you know, Congressman, I'm not actually the Antichrist. Zinke was taken aback by her comment and mumbled something about not having meant it. One thing I've learned over the years is how easy it is for some people to say horrible things about me when I'm not around, but how hard it is for them to look me in the eye and say it to my face. Now, if only Hillary Clinton had understood that the difference here, if only they would say things to my face, that's the actual world, that's the actual community. What she's discovering here, the horrible things said about her when she's not around, is her identification of what it is to face the internal world of her opponents, and by extension of the electorate. So if we're going to, quote unquote, grow up, if we're going to get better at being Democrats, we're going to have to include the community of the internal world, which is not a kumbaya world. It's a pretty disturbing world. It is, however, more real. It's where we live. For better and worse, it's where we live. We don't want people to know what's going on in our mind for very good reason. You have to be in a very special environment to be foolish enough to tell someone what's going on in your mind. But we have to find ways to access the internal world, the internal community, if we have any hope for moving democracy forward in the ways that it can move forward as the talking cure, which is what it does if there's true freedom of representation. I'm going to stop there and we'll see what you'll want to talk about.
So, there'll be questions, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm still thinking about lots of ideas that you've raised and discussed. I'm most puzzled, though, at the moment, and I'm hoping you can say a little bit more about how it is that the mental world is a community.
Sorry.
How is the internal life a community? And here's maybe the problem is that I don't maybe conceive of what you're calling the actual community in the same way. So you said there needs to be camaraderie, everybody gets along. And I just think there are lots of communities in which we're different, and if things aren't going well, maybe we are disagreeing and hopefully being respectful, but we're not all the same and we don't always get along. But it doesn't make us not a community. So when I'm thinking about, right, the mental life as a community, I'm thinking, well, in the actual world, if I'm off writing a paper or something all by myself, I'm not in a community, right? I mean, I'm a member of communities, I have community friends or whatever, but I'm not physically in a community when I'm doing that activity. So in my mental life, there isn't anyone else for me to be with. So I'm trying to sort of picture, the Inside Out, the Pixar movie, like maybe my different emotions have discussions, and that's one way that I have a mental community, but that doesn't seem like what you're talking about, right? And so another way maybe would be if I'm having some relationships with fictitious or fantasized characters who are in my actual life, but then I'm in control of it all, so it's still just me. So yeah, so can you help me think about how my internal life is a community, and what you mean by that?
Well, the internal world, if you take the dream for example, or a dream. In a dream, lots of things will happen. You're going to meet lots of people in the dream. You're going to be talking to them, they're going to be talking to you. They're going to be talking to each other. And all kinds of interesting events are going to be taking place, from nice ones to pretty disturbing ones. And so a large part of our life is spent dreaming. And so that's an example of the internal community of many other people, and you being in conversation with them. Now, you're not in conscious conversation with them, per se. It's part of the unconscious world, or unconscious. Recent research has indicated that during the day, we spend 47% of our time daydreaming. So during that 47% of the time, we're lost in imaginary conversations or imaginary events with other people. One part of unconscious life that I find quite interesting is what I call the assumed. Now, the assumed is that we can have a conversation with someone in our minds without actually ever literally talking to them in our minds. We don't picture them sitting there in a chair and us talking to them. No. We assume it's happened. Now, the capacity for this sort of thinking, the assumed, I call it the assumed unconscious, is predicated upon the speed with which the brain can process information, can do it. So in other words, based upon prior conversations, based upon the paradigm of conversation, we can assume we've had this conversation. And the mind is such that actually, if you were to ask somebody, well, what was the conversation about? What did you really go through? We could probably write up a paper on what took place in our minds, even though literally it was not fully articulate, it was not imagined. To some extent, this has got to do with the difference between having a thought and having an image. Ideas or thoughts, usually they're not at all. They're clusters of unconscious phenomena that give us the feeling that something has been fully thought through, or fully considered. In fact, it hasn't. So lots of folks, when they enter analysis, will have in mind that they're going to talk about a certain thing, and they want to talk about something completely different. And they can't understand why they're not talking about what they thought they were going to think about. I think they're terribly frustrated. But that's because you can't actually, none of us can actually articulate our thoughts inside. We can go some way towards doing it. Like today, I've been doing it because I've rehearsed this quite all the times in my mind. But if I were relaxed to speak freely about whatever was on my mind, and I had ideas, think about this or think about that, what came out of my mouth, what I would be talking about, would be very different from what I was thinking about. So your point is an important one, but I would say that in our internal worlds, we are relating to far more people in one moment in time than we are in the actual world. Because, for example, sitting where you are, if you've been drifting off, which would have been a smart thing to have done, you could have been thinking about a friend in Ohio or something like that. You could have been thinking about your mom. You could have been thinking about your brother or sister or whatever. You could have been thinking about, what book you left at home and what you got to read. You could have been talking about something to someone else. You could have been with 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 people in the course of this half an hour. Now, they're not literally in this room, are they?
But they're also representations, my representations of
That's right.
people, right? So that's my question, is that how are my representations of people, real or not, a community?
Because you organize them into a group. They're part of your group life. For the most part, they are real people. They have come from your real history. But you have changed them. It's just like writing a novel. It's kind of like fiction, but it's also autobiographical. So the novel, fictive, comes out of the capacity to create another world that's somewhere between the way internal life is and the way actual life is. My point really here is that we think of doing things and saying things in the internal world we wouldn't dream of doing, most of us, in the actual world. And we wouldn't want people in the actual world to know about this. So, in discussing this other community, the community of the internal world, I'm juxtaposing it to the actual community in which we live. I quite like your point and agree with it, that some of the communities we live in are very diverse, and where there are a lot of divergent views, and that is viewed by us as a good thing. That would be a more democratic community. The history of communities is, though, they tend to be groups, they tend to group around preferences, likes, they tend to be exclusive. And the so-called gated communities, which California to some extent, or we can go back to gated communities in the Middle Ages, really are there to preserve sameness and exclude people from the outside. One of the questions that we face today is the one over immigration, about migrants, both in Europe and in the United States. But an immigrant is simply a being, a human being, who provokes anxieties in the indigenous population. And we project all kinds of stuff into the immigrant. All of our fears, all of our violence is projected into this. So let's take a Mexican. Some powerful person in this country might think of a Mexican as somebody who intends to engage in sexual activities that are horrifying, who is criminal, doing something underhanded, and will not, it's hard to catch the criminal. And if that person himself has committed sexual violence or is a sexist, has refused to report certain sorts of economic activities that are probably criminal, you can then project that into a Mexican and say, we don't want these people in this country. And other people will agree with you, we don't want them. So we tend to project our stuff into immigrants. And one of the interesting things about the immigration is the populations that are the most paranoid about foreigners, about immigrants, are those that are homogenous, usually isolated in rural areas, far away from the cities. It's all in the mind. Whereas in the cities, where you have more immigrants, there's less paranoia. The more multicultural a society, the more multicultural a city, or a cosmopolis, the less paranoia there is. Why? Because we actually meet these people. They mitigate the other community in our mind, composed of fears and anxieties, etc. Whereas if we go to Minnesota, or Wisconsin, or Michigan, or North Dakota, where I spend a lot of the year, if you ask them, they don't see anybody from Syria or from wherever. And very few Mexicans. They're full of ideas about how awful these people are. So it's not like one world excludes the other, but we just need to keep in mind the internal world community that is so much a part of our existence.
Thank you for your talk. You made a good point earlier about the internal world and in group. I would reinterpret it as group intelligence or groupthink. Right now, what I've pondered recently is that we've kind of gone back in our politics or in our groupthink. There's certain individuals in power that are homogenized. They don't see the other. They fear the other. They fear history. They fear even evolving, talking about reality. What would you recommend, I think, for us in the ivory tower to try to maybe interrupt their internal groupthink? Is it an external expression? Is it compassion? What would you recommend?
It's a great question. I think that the best thing to do would be to join we're talking about the ivory tower, would be to go and meet with folks from other ivory towers, but not in the same ivory tower you inhabit, so that you're not afraid to say something in that ivory tower, that collection of people from the ivory tower, because you're not going to be inhibited by the social demand that you not be a disgrace to your department, that you be a noble and obviously good person. You wouldn't want to say anything that would compromise that. So the fear of being shamed is huge. So one has to be able to free, really free. That's why the psychoanalysis is in some way so efficacious, because you're going to talk to that person. There's nobody else in the room, and you can say whatever you want to say. And if you're a European analyst, that means you can't report on anything. I mean, they can tell you whatever is going on with them, and you have to keep your mouth shut. So if you can trust, and building trust with fellow academics is really an important thing. I don't think it will work if you're working with people in the same department, because of the enormous pressure to preserve the false self. The false self is essential. We simply can't go around saying to each other, "Oh, but I've just had the most weird thought about you. Would you hang out a moment?" We can't do that. And so we don't want compulsive true self activity. False selves are very important, and the false self is very important towards maintaining social cohesion. But we shouldn't let that be at the expense of means to represent our internal worlds and share them with others and get help. And so the democratic process is kind of cool because you get people from all over the place. They're kind of forced to cohabit, but because they disagree with each other, there's no demand that they all be the same, and therefore you can have a wide range of differences, which is free in itself. Oh.
Thank you for, sorry. Can you hear me? Oh, wow. Sorry. Thank you for coming to speak to us. I like what you're saying about thinking about the democratic process as a therapeutic situation, like the first talking cure, like you said. And I also appreciate how you have kind of a broad conception of it that acknowledges origins in different places than ancient Greece. And my question is this. It's more about the decision-making, like the formal decision-making that we usually associate with the democratic process. And so often we think about voting or either direct vote or representational voting. But a lot of the examples that you shared sound to me like situations that are more like consensus. I've participated in some activist organizations that make decisions by consensus. And so rather than taking a vote, everybody has to agree. And the organizations that I was a part of were not wanting to call that democratic because in order to have voting, you need to have membership. And we were committed to not having strict membership boundaries. And so that's why we wanted to have consensus so anybody who came into the room could share in the spirit that you're saying. And so I just was, wanting to know what you thought about that more formal aspect of how a group makes a decision. Because it seems like you were talking about the Tavistad group. Membership seemed to matter. It seemed to matter that it was the same 10 people every time.
Yeah.
And in our actual community, every room I enter, a different membership constitutes itself. And so I was just wondering what you thought about that, or how that.
I suppose the consensus within that transient situation would be that we have an agreement, perhaps not explicit, that we shall go only so far in what we say to each other. So there's a sense of propriety based upon the culture of those groups. That's fine, that's fair enough. We do need to know what the rules are for any group that we're in. So the democratic process can be found in many different places, many different forms, and by no means only within governments. In fact, in NGOs, in universities, in corporations, you can find a room for democratic process if there are no inhibiting authorities around. You're not going to find folks in middle management feeling free to talk about what they think if the senior executives are around. So they're not going to do it. And so, there are many different kinds of groups. The democratic process is all over the place. All over the place. It's interesting that we don't really have it to begin with. That is, family life is not a democratic process. In fact, if we think about it, and perhaps we don't want to, and it would be too much to think about, families are one of the most disturbed formations that exists. Ironically, a child's internal world of fantasy, of imagination, is far more democratic than the family itself. Children have far more freedom to roam about in their minds than they do in their bloody family. Because of the power of the father, and the power of the mother, and the fact of sibling rivalries. This is about as asymmetrical a situation as you can find yourself in. And by the way, you're kind of stupid because you're a 2-year-old. You don't have a chance to represent yourself. So you're diminished. So families are tragic. And Sophocles and Shakespeare would not have picked up on the family as the one thing they really want to focus on when they want to objectify the most screwed up moments in human existence. So we survive our families, thank God. We then find, strangely enough, respite in group. School can can be a wonderful place. It can be horrifying, but it can be wonderful because it accords more with the freedom of the mind than that sort of strange structure that exists in what we call a family.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. And just so you know, I speak as a professor of Russian literature. And your comment there actually pointed in the direction of one of the things I wanted to say. I was interested, it was fascinating, but I was also interested in this basic assumption that every individual matters, which is kind of democratic in itself. And I think Russia offers us, for example, and other places as well, offers us examples where that's not the case, with purges and gulags and soldiers, conscripts, life treated very casually. And that brings me to the question of whether the mind of the citizen of a totalitarian society is in itself different. Do we have a sort of pro-democratic assumptions here to begin with? I think, for example, of censorship, which I've been doing a little bit of work on, and of course the internal censor too, which plagues the citizen of a totalitarian society, to such an extent where even a Soviet citizen might say something like, in the Soviet Union, we do not have sex in the Soviet Union, right? It goes to say so publicly on television. I was also thinking of the child, so I'm glad you pointed in that direction. The child does not live in a democracy, and actually the child of a totalitarian state is a child that is even more closely policed in those cases and controlled in order to prepare the citizen. And then that finally brings me to sort of perhaps a non sequitur, but in the contemporary situation too, of how Russia is hijacking democracy now, exploiting those very freedoms to provoke and sicken democracy along the very points of its strength and weakness, and that kind of lack of censorship in order to sicken democracy. So just kind of thinking from the totalitarian kind of contrast here.
Thank you. When I was at Berkeley, part of my area of concentration was on antebellum South and on the war and on the life of African Americans. And I studied with Kenneth Stamp, who wrote a book called The Peculiar Institution. And one of Stamp's books, The Peculiar Institution, was really an attempt to answer Stanley Elkin's argument in another book, in which Elkin's point was that the Peculiar Institution of plantations had degraded the capacity of African Americans to think, and they were lesser beings as a result of this. What Stamp argued was that they adopted behaviors which would indicate diminished capabilities in order to survive. But they survived by putting forward a false representation of themselves. I did work behind the Iron Curtain. I taught and supervised in Poland and in Hungary before Glasnost. And one of the things that sort of surprised me, but I suppose it shouldn't, is that when they got behind closed doors and the police were not around, these folks just went boom right into full-on representation of themselves. So I think that we're resilient. Human beings are remarkably resilient. I'm quite sure that North Koreans who look like, androids are individuals with internal worlds. They're complex, caught up in a mass paranoid hysterical formation, for sure. When it comes to the Russian involvement in the American election, here's where I would go with this. Yes, what Putin did or tried to do and has been doing is bad. We haven't admitted to the fact that we've been doing that to them as well. One of the reasons he hates Hillary Clinton is Clinton tried to interfere with his last election while she was Secretary of State. Americans tend not to see that. So Putin didn't like what we were trying to do to him in his own country. And furthermore, when we think that the Russians are the ones who are involved, who are sponsoring hateful attacks upon Democrats wherever in the United States, okay, that's true, but who else is doing that? Us, we have our own homebred terrorists here in the United States, in the Republican Party, on the far right. And we need to say, wait a minute, let's not put all this into Putin. We don't have to do that, Is it the case that Trump's campaign collaborated with the Russians? Well, maybe. But what's worse, in my view, is they've collaborated with the most destructive sides of the human personality. That's the collaboration we should be looking at, is the internal world. So, and I think that if we were able to get folks to talk about, well, what's it feel like to, because, you know, we live in North Dakota, my wife has a Facebook account, and on Facebook, what the North Dakotans were saying about Hillary Clinton, or I'm sorry, about Barack Obama, if we printed that out, I mean, it's terrifying. And these are local farmers, Lutherans, go to church every Saturday, you know, farmers, the heart and soul of America. And my word, I tell you, if that were printed out and you said, you know, who are these people? It's disturbing unless you say, well, now wait just a minute, don't get too self-righteous here, because you're one of them too, and we're all in this together, and we all think bad thoughts, we're all capable of some pretty nasty things. And so I would rather go down that road. And in groups where I help people in governmental, you know, geopolitical situations where there's real enmity, one of the rules is you can say whatever you want to about yourself. If you want to apologize for your country's behaviors to somebody else in that room, you're free to do it. Do not say anything else about anyone else's country. That's the beginning. There's sort of, you have to have ground rules to behave. So one of the questions is, well, why can't nations say, I'm sorry? I mean, how many Americans know that we shot down an Iranian jumbo jet by mistake? We shot it down though, but most Americans can't remember when that was. And then we did it. 387 people went to their death because we shot down one of their planes. We tend to forget that we supported Sadat and the Shah of Iran. And the Iranians have very good reason to hate us, to be extremely wary of us. And we've interfered in the history of Iran over the last 100 years. They've been interfered with so many times. They have every reason in the world to, upon hearing the term the United States of America, say, all right, where are they? And what are they doing to us now? So I'm not saying that you're wonderful people. I'm not saying, I would never say that about anybody. There are no such things as wonderful people. I'm sorry, there just aren't. There are just people. And so, I think if we were able to say to the Iranians, look, we're sorry, you know, we really dropped you by supporting the Shah because it was our vital national interests. We know Sadat terrorized your country. We know we supported it. So we understand why you hate us, and we're sorry. If we were able to do that on the international stage, don't you think it would make for world peace? I mean, the militarists, the narcissists, the sociopaths, people invested in war and hate and murder wouldn't like it because peace is against their economic interests. The arms trade industry would collapse. The whole edifice would come crumbling down if we started to make reparation on the international level. But we can do it. So Clinton went to Africa and apologized. Obama went to Hiroshima and sort of apologized. But what's the problem? If you do something wrong, apologize. That heals the victim. That makes the victim feel less persecuted, less infuriated, and it doesn't get passed on transgeneration. So we have to bring, in my view, the best part of human psychology, our understanding of psychology. You don't have to be a psychoanalyst to say this stuff, but it helps to have people who are analysts or analytical psychologists or people in the mental health profession to become more active players in international politics if we're going to stop killing each other. But again, as I said, I think we want to murder each other. So analysts and psychologists are people who are party poopers. We're going to spoil the fun because it's fun to hate. No, it really is fun to hate. I've hated before, and I probably hate now. I can't think of anyone right off the bat. But when I used to have favorite sports teams, I had favorite enemies. You know, yeah, I hated Tottenham Hotspur for quite a long time because I was an Arsenal fan. But then the hate kind of waned as I got older, and I just kind of gave it up. But it was fun to hate them.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Since we're at the university, one of the things that, of course, I found striking in recent political debate is how much right-voting people think of the university as destructive for society. And the reason they cite is, of course, political correctness. So I'd like your thoughts on that. I mean, that people walk with torches in Charlottesville and elsewhere too, in the name of basically claiming their voice in a context where they have been silenced by political correctness. So how will we negotiate that?
Could you say just a little bit more? What you're saying is terribly important, but I want to make sure I understand you. So you're saying folks on the right have a special irritation with people in the universities whom they see as somehow living within the culture of political correctness.
Mm-hmm.
And the question therefore is, what?
It's true. I'm not. My question is a little confused.
No, you're not.
Don't.
Right on the tip.
I want your thoughts on this because on the one hand, I agree with all your points. That we have to be more democratic in a sense with our internal objects.
Yeah.
I know that we can't act out on them. But it strikes me that, those marchers in Charlottesville, I guess they would certainly agree with you too.
Well, to me it's a matter of balance in a way. In other words, identity politics, let's say, which is very often associated with political correctness, was a terribly important part of the evolution of civil rights in the United States, and not just the United States, around the world. The merit of being part of any one of those particular movements, whether it was women's rights, gay rights, or whatever, speaks for itself. I think what bothers people on the so-called right is, although they are bothered by, in some respects, by some of these specific identity politic movements, but it's kind of interesting that people even in the heart of the Midwest are for gay marriage. They're for all kinds of things you would think they're not, they wouldn't be for, but they are. I think the problem is when those involved in identity politics become triumphalists and celebrate this as that which separates them and distinguishes them from all the rest of humanity as virtuous beings, highly virtuous beings. So it's great for people in those movements to have fought for them. It is. It makes for a better world. It doesn't mean, though, it's made them into a better person. And some of the people in those movements have become so sanctimonious and rising transcendentally above everyone else that, of course, it creates the proletariat of the unprivileged. Those who have not been part of those identities are part of an intellectual proletariat that's left behind and it's not represented. So there's this sort of like, well, what about me? What about us? You're part of the majority. Fuck off. So there is this arrogance in the identity politics movement. This celebration, and if you take the ways in which the media portrays it, and the media is coastal. It's either East Coast or West Coast. The rest of the country really is it's just not represented. So you can see there's a certain kind of hatred and envy of the seeming privilege of those on the East and West Coast, and so on. The fact that it gets located at universities, say Berkeley, which is kind of like the exemplar of the privileged identity political movement. If these demonstrations don't happen at the University of North Dakota, or Iowa State, or at the NDSU, where those are schools where got great football teams or this or that. They tend to be really directly at the coastal universities. I do think there's too great a division between communities in this country. I mean, between the sort of right wing, there is no left wing in America, with all due respect. They call it the left wing, but there's no left wing political group here. I wouldn't know what to call. Maybe they're just nice people, or people I feel closer to, or whatever. People that I want to hang out with, call the, but I don't know what to name them. There's too great a division in this country, and that deeply concerns me because, you know, if we keep going down that path, then we're really in deep trouble. And remember projective identification. If we start hating each other too much, we're going to project that hate outward, and that can go to lead to an international situation of great war. I mean, we love Putin now. Both sides love Putin because we can blame him for our political situation. And you know, he's not a, you know, he's guilty of meddling. He's not a good guy. Maybe he is in some ways, but in other ways he's a bad guy. He kills people, I guess. So it doesn't make him exactly a great guy. But if we get caught up in thinking about Putin and the Russians, oh my word, that's a great distraction. Everything we put into Putin, we should be looking at ourselves and say, okay, how are we like him? How are we doing what he did? You know?
Okay, well, I do have one last question. I know our time is up, but I can say with confidence that there's some pretty delicious food just beyond those doors, so which we're all invited to share. I guess I just want to ask, I just want to clear up love before we go break for lunch. And what I think I understood about what you're saying, and I have a question. So I was so taken by your insight that when you are in groups, when you were working in groups, and when democracy was working, the effects of one person upon another started to fade. You said the impression, the Eindruck, the impression faded after time. And then you said something, you started thinking that something like love started to develop in the group. So my question for you is, are you suggesting that these effects of the other, the differences that impress, are these effects experienced as incursions against the self, when someone has an effect upon you? And because those effects diminish over time, which would lead me to think that in contrast to the effect upon oneself, when love develops, something like a recognition instead happens. So that rather than that the fixity of the self is dissolved into the others around the room. Is that right? And that's why one becomes almost indifferent to the effect of the other, because one is with the other.
It's a paradox, because if we didn't have an effect upon one another, the convergence between one another would be meaningless. It's precisely because we are so different, but we abandon that difference in the course of forming and becoming part of a group. This constitutes an act of love between people. So it would be meaningless were we not still highly individual, quite specific, and quite impressionable, and also able to impress others.
So that's why it's not a kumbaya. It's not a dissolution of identity. It's emerging. It's not emerging. So I think the first question, which was suggesting that what you're saying is that there's no room for contestation. In fact, there is room for contestation and difference.
I was just wanting to, I wasn't understanding this. It's really helpful.
Okay. Thank you so very much. And let's eat.